Do you know who I am? I funded the new maternity ward of this hospital. I will have your license revoked before you can even blink.
That is your right, sir. But you are still not going through this corridor.
She was never meant to survive. That's what the men in the tinted SUVs thought as they sped past the hospital gates that morning. But they were wrong. And so was the politician who had just made the gravest error of his life. The intensive care unit at St. Luke's General Hospital in Enugu never slept. Monitors beeped in steady, urgent rhythms. The air, thick with the smell of methylated spirit and quiet desperation, hummed with the low whir of ceiling fans. Nurses moved with purpose, their words few, because in this unit, a wasted second was a life stolen. Amara Okafor had worked this floor for 6 years. At 29, she was the one the younger nurses called when a vein collapsed, when a family's wails echoed through the hallway, when a patient crashed in the dead of night, and panic began to set in. She was the quiet center of gravity that held the chaos together. She was also 6 months pregnant. Her feet ached. A dull, persistent throb had taken root in her lower back, starting by the 4th hour of every grueling 12-hour shift. But she never complained. She would just place a hand gently on her belly between rooms, take a slow, steadying breath, and keep moving. None of her coworkers knew much about her life beyond the hospital walls. She didn't speak of her hometown, nor mention any family. When people asked, she'd offer a warm smile and change the subject. Nobody knew. Nobody was supposed to know that the quiet nurse adjusting the IV line in room 6 was the childhood friend of Abena, the Rex Madu. And Abena did not work in a hospital. He did not attend political rallies or appear on the cover of business magazines. He moved through the city like a rumor, a current beneath the surface, invisible until the exact moment he chose to strike. He was the most powerful and feared figure in the entire Southeast underworld. His syndicate had no name. His face was in no police database. He had kept that brutal world completely separate from Amara for years. Not out of shame, but because she had begged him to.
Let me be normal. Let me just be a person.
She had told him when they were young, sitting on a rusty bus. Let me just be a person. He had honored that vow always. But peace, as it often does, has enemies. The double doors at the end of the hallway banged open at exactly 2:14. Every head on the floor turned. The man striding through them wore a crisp, white agbada, heavily embroidered with gold thread that glinted under the fluorescent lights. His name was Chief Banji Adenuga. He was a 50-year-old oil magnate turned senator, a man who had built his career on intimidation and had never, not once, heard the word no without unleashing severe consequences. Behind him, a jittery personal assistant held a handkerchief wrapped around the chief's left thumb, a small cut, the kind you get from a broken champagne glass at a victory party, the kind that needed a plaster, not an ICU. Chief Banji didn't know that. Or rather, Chief Banji didn't care. He scanned the unit as if he owned it, which, in his mind, he practically did. His last philanthropic gesture had funded the hospital's new pediatric wing, a fact he reminded everyone of with a framed, life-sized portrait of himself in the lobby. I need a doctor immediately.
I need a doctor immediately.
His voice boomed, cutting through the monitor beeps.
Not a house officer, not a student, a real one.
Not a house officer, not a student, a real one. A young doctor named Emeka hurried towards him, hands outstretched, his voice a calm, placating murmur. He tried to explain. This floor is critical care, sir. Your AIDS injury is minor. The main A and E is 2 floors down.
This floor is critical care, sir. Your AIDS injury is minor. The main A&E is 2 floors down.
Chief Banji grabbed the collar of Dr. Emeka's coat and shoved him violently against a medicine trolley. A tray of instruments crashed to the floor. The entire unit froze, a collective breath held in shock. The chief stepped forward, his eyes scanning for an empty bed, a compliant nurse, anyone who would simply obey. Amara stepped out of room 6. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, a calm but immovable presence. Chief Banji stopped in his tracks, his jaw tightened. He looked at her with the dismissive contempt powerful men often reserve for those they deem insignificant. "Do you know who I am?"
Do you know who I am?
His voice dropped into a menacing growl.
I funded the new maternity ward at this hospital. I will have your license revoked before you can even blink.
That is your right, sir. But you are still not going through this corridor.
Something dangerous shifted in his face. The arrogant mask of a politician cracked, and a raw, cold fury seeped through. He pulled out a checkbook from his agbada and thrust it toward the terrified Dr. Emeka, who had pressed himself against the wall. "Write him a figure,"
Write him a figure.
Chief Banji commanded. "Whatever it takes to evacuate one of these patients. I don't care which one. I need this bed."
Whatever it takes to evacuate one of these patients. I don't care which one. I need this bed.
Emeka's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Amara spoke instead.
Put that away.
Her voice was steady as a rock.
Money doesn't determine which patients are stable enough to be moved.
The man in room 4 just came out of open heart surgery 11 hours ago. He cannot be relocated for a hand cut. The chief turned to her slowly, the checkbook still open.
"You're a mess,"
he said, and the way he spat the word made it sound like a vile insult.
"You don't make these calls on my floor."
I do.
She replied. For a moment the world stopped. Then Chief Banji erupted. It was a torrent of abuse, loud and ugly and merciless. He called her incompetent. He mocked the faded print of her uniform. He insulted her education, her salary, her entire family lineage.
Incompetent. I see the faded print of your uniform. Your education is a joke. You are a disgrace to your entire family.
He said things that made the junior nurses at the station stare at the floor, their faces burning with second-hand shame. Amara absorbed every word, her expression unmoving. She turned calmly towards the wall phone to call security. That was when Chief Banji hit her. The sound was sickeningly sharp, a brutal crack that echoed in the sterile silence. His palm connected with the side of her face with the full force of his weight. Her head snapped sideways. The patient chart she was holding clattered to the floor. She stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the nursing station counter, and her hands flew instinctively to her belly, cradling the curve of it, shielding her child. She didn't fall, but she closed her eyes for a second, and in that second, a whole universe of fear and pain was laid bare. The floor was silent, not just quiet, but a vacuum of sound that follows an irreversible act. A young nurse named Chisholm stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. The security guard near the elevator had his hand on his radio, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. Nobody moved. Chief Banji adjusted the collar of his agbada.
"Maybe now you understand how things work,"
he said. Down the hallway near the exit stairwell, a tall man in a simple black senator wear stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He hadn't moved since the doors first slammed open. He had witnessed the entire scene. The shoving, the threats, the slap, the way Amara's hands flew to her pregnant belly. He had a small, intricate tattoo on the left side of his neck, a coiled python, its eyes half open, watching. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply took out his phone, typed 4 words, and sent the message. Then he disappeared through the side door. 60 seconds later, the chief medical director, Dr. Balagun, arrived. He was a 62-year-old man with silver hair and an undeserved reputation for diplomacy. He surveyed the scene. Amara, still bracing herself against the counter, and the chief, standing with his arms crossed like a king surveying a conquered land. He made his decision in under 3 seconds. He chose wrong.
"Chief Adenuga."
Dr. Balagun moved towards the politician with his hand extended, his voice oiled with apology.
"I am so deeply sorry for this disgraceful treatment."
"Let's get you taken care of immediately." Amara stared at him. He didn't look at her, not once. The chief rolled his shoulders.
"Your nurse was aggressive and obstructed patient care. I defended myself."
Dr. Balagun nodded as if he were hearing a perfectly reasonable weather report. He didn't check the security cameras. He didn't ask the many witnesses. He didn't even glance at the angry red welt blooming across the face of the pregnant woman 10 feet away. He turned to Amara, and his voice went flat and cold.
"I'm going to have to let you go, effective immediately." Please surrender your ID card and clear your locker.
The shock hit her not as words, but as a physical blow to her chest. The true pain was the silence of her colleagues, the doctors and nurses and security guards who had watched her be assaulted and were now staring intently at their shoes, too afraid for their own jobs to speak. 2 security guards escorted her out, not roughly, but with a firmness designed to humiliate. She handed over her ID, emptied her locker of its few personal belongings into a polythene bag, and walked the long, familiar corridor for the last time, past the patients she'd comforted, past the break room where she'd shared dreams with colleagues, past the room where she'd once held a dying woman's hand because no family had come. The front doors opened, and the harsh harmattan wind hit her face. She stood on the dusty sidewalk and pulled out her phone. An SMS had already arrived from a powerful Abuja-based law firm. Chief Banji Adenuga was suing her for defamation, professional misconduct, and emotional distress. She read it twice. Then she started walking. The next morning, her debit card was declined at the market. Her accounts were frozen. The chief's legal team worked with terrifying speed. When she got home to her modest one-room apartment, an eviction notice, citing a baseless violation of tenancy, was nailed to her door. She sat in the darkening room, placed both hands on her stomach, and breathed slowly until the trembling stopped. She had left her old life in the village years ago to build something clean, something earned, a life that was hers alone. She had built it shift by shift, patient by patient. Now it had been destroyed in a single afternoon. She held the weight of that reality for a long, painful moment. Then she stood up. She walked to her small wardrobe, moved a stack of neatly folded wrappers, and found the fireproof safe box hidden behind them. Inside was a small, cheap-feature phone she had charged once a year, just in case. Just in case had finally arrived. She dialed a number she had memorized a lifetime ago. Abena answered on the first ring. He already knew. He'd been the man in the hallway. He had seen the slap, watched her hands go to her stomach, watched the CMD choose a donor over his most loyal nurse. He had walked out not from a lack of care, but because Amara had made him promise years ago that he would never act in her world unless she asked him to. He had spent the last 22 hours in agonizing silence, waiting. When her voice came through the phone, quiet and fractured, he closed his eyes. "I need your help," she whispered. That was all.
You don't have to say another word.
Abena said. His voice was a deep, calm river.
Go and rest. I will handle it.
He placed the phone down on the mahogany desk of his private office, looked out at the sprawling city of Enugu from his window, and made 4 calls. By morning, the storm had already begun for Chief Banji Adenuga. The chief found out at his private club, the Ebony Lounge, a place of leather chairs and crystal decanters where menus don't have prices. He had ordered a bottle of cognac worth more than a nurse's annual salary to celebrate the sacking of a pregnant woman who had dared to talk back to him. When he placed his platinum card on the tray, the waiter returned 2 minutes later, his face a mask of professional terror. "Declined, sir." The chief snatched the card, red-faced and blustering. He made a call to his bank manager. He had 6 missed calls already. His company's stock was in freefall, having plummeted 23% in the last 3 hours. His offshore accounts, 3 of them in jurisdictions chosen for their secrecy, were empty. Not drained, but empty, as if the billions had never existed. Then his chief of security, a hardened ex-soldier, got a text message. The chief watched the man read it, watched all the color drain from his face, watched him put his phone in his pocket, stand up, and walk out of the club without a single word. Chief Banji sat alone at a table with an untouchable bottle of cognac and no way to pay for it. He spent the night trying to hire people to fix his catastrophic problem. He reached out to contacts, dangerous men, who had made inconvenient problems disappear for powerful politicians before. He met the first one in a dimly lit mechanic workshop at midnight, a bag of US dollars on the bonnet of a car. He showed the man what he'd found on his doorstep when he got home, a black envelope sealed with dark red wax, stamped with the image of a coiled python. The man looked at the seal for a long moment. Then, without a word, he pushed the money back, got in his car, and sped away. The second fixer didn't even sit down. He saw the seal and shook his head before the chief could finish his sentence. The third, a man with a fearsome scar across his face and a reputation for taking the jobs nobody else would touch, looked at the seal, looked at the chief, and said quietly, "Olga, you laid your hands on someone you shouldn't have touched. There is nobody in this entire country who will take this job, not for any amount of money." "Why?" the chief demanded, his voice cracking. "Who is this madman?"
Why? Who's this madman?
The scarred man looked at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "Because the person who sent that envelope doesn't do negotiations. He just does collections." The chief, sweating now, drove himself to a private airstrip at 2:00 a.m. He had a jet, emergency cash, and a plan. Flee the country, get to a non-extradition nation, rebuild from the ashes. He was 50 feet from the jet's stairs when the high-beam headlights hit him. 3 black SUVs emerged from the dark edges of the tarmac, like silent predators that had been waiting for hours, which they had. 6 men in dark suits stepped out. No weapons were drawn, no voices raised. They simply took his arms, placed a black hood over his head, and drove him away. When they removed the hood, Chief Banji was kneeling on a cold marble floor. The room was vast and almost completely dark, save for a single lamp at the far end of a long table. Sitting there, sipping a cup of pepper soup with an expression of unnerving calm, was the man from the hospital hallway. The python tattoo was clearly visible on his neck. Abena set his spoon down and looked at Chief Banji Adnuga, the way one looks at a minor accounting error that has already been resolved. The chief's instincts defaulted to bluster. It was the only tool he'd ever possessed. "I am a serving senator of the Federal Republic," he sputtered, his voice laced with fear. "You have no idea whose toes you are stepping on." Abena slid a sleek tablet across the table. It stopped just before the chief's knees. On the screen was the ICU security footage. Full resolution, clear as day. It showed everything. The shove, the verbal abuse, the violent slap. Amara's hands wrapping protectively around her stomach. Dr. Balagun nodding along like a lizard catching flies. The chief stared, his bluster deflating. Abena said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice a quiet, chilling whisper. "You thought she was alone."
You thought she was alone?
He leaned forward slightly. "She has me." A smartly dressed lawyer stepped out of the shadows with a stack of documents. Abena explained the terms without any emotion. Every single asset, the oil blocks, the properties in Ikoyi and London, the fleet of cars, the hidden accounts, was to be immediately and irrevocably transferred into a legal trust. But the plot twist came here. The fund was not for Abena. It was to be used specifically to build and fully fund a network of safe houses for victims of domestic violence across all 36 states of Nigeria, starting right here in Enugu. The donation was structured so it could never be reversed or embezzled by future administrators. The chief, a man who had built his entire identity on power and wealth, sobbed openly as he signed. Real, ugly tears of a man watching his entire legacy evaporate. When it was done, the men put the hood over his head again. They drove for 20 minutes. When they pushed him out of the vehicle, he hit a wet, muddy road. He tore the hood off his head and looked up. The emergency entrance sign of St. Luke's General Hospital, the same building. He was in the exact spot where Amara had stood after being fired, clutching a polythene bag of her belongings. He sat in the mud with nothing but the clothes on his back, and as the sun began to rise, blue police lights flooded the scene. Abena had sent a perfectly documented, anonymous dossier of the chief's decades of grand corruption and money laundering to the EFCC. The quietest people in the room are never the weakest. They're just the ones who haven't decided to move yet. The morning sun streamed through the windows of a private suite on the top floor of the hospital. The room was warm and smelled of fresh flowers. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains. Amara held her newborn daughter against her chest. The baby had her grandmother's calm eyes and a full head of curly black hair, and lungs that had announced her arrival to the entire floor. She was perfect. Abena stood near the door, his hands folded, looking at his godchild with an expression Amara had never seen on his face before, something unguarded, gentle, and deeply human. He had bought the entire hospital 2 months ago through a complex web of holding companies. The board didn't know who the new owner was until the ink was dry, and then they knew. Dr. Balagun had been quietly and immediately asked to step down as CMD, but as it turned out, the new ownership had already processed his immediate redeployment. He was currently working 2 floors below, not as a doctor. The cleaning and sanitation department had been severely short-staffed. As Amara watched her daughter sleep, she heard the faint, rhythmic squeak of a mop bucket in the hallway. She glanced up through the open door. She could see him, Balagun, older and more stooped than she remembered, moving slowly, his eyes downcast. He passed the doorway. He looked in. He saw her, a queen on her bed. He quickly looked away and kept mopping. She didn't call after him. She simply looked back at her daughter's face. Abena crossed the room and stood beside the bed. He looked at the baby for a long, quiet moment, then at Amara.
Adima?
He asked softly, "Are you well?" She let out a small, tired, real laugh. "I'm good," she said. "I am finally good." He nodded once, as if that single statement settled a massive debt he'd been carrying for years. Downstairs in an EFCC holding cell, Chief Banji Adenuga sat in a filthy jumpsuit. The wealth was gone. The power was gone. The sycophants and the fixers were all gone. He had spent 50 years building a life where no was a word other people said. He had just learned in the most catastrophic way possible what happens when you are wrong about that. The storm was over, not because the powerful man had fallen, though he had completely, not because the cowardly doctor was now mopping floors, though he was, but because she was here in this sunlit room with her daughter breathing softly in her arms and her childhood friend, the king of a dark world, standing quietly as her protector. She had fought her whole life for a simple, normal life. She hadn't realized that sometimes the people who love you fight for it too. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us which country you are watching from.